The wind was a file, grating against bone, stripping away warmth layer by agonizing layer. Lila lay curled in a shallow depression of cracked earth, the thin hide clothing offering little defense against the prairie's indifferent cruelty. Days, maybe weeks, had bled into a single, numb ache. Her tribe had gone, the swift horses carrying them like leaves before a storm, leaving her broken leg and inconvenient presence behind. They had left provisions, a meager pouch of dried meat, a water skin near empty, a final, damning act of mercy or ritualistic abandonment. She wasn't sure which was worse. The silence that followed their departure had been the most terrifying sound she had ever known. It screamed of absolute aloneness. Pain was a dull, constant companion, a heavy cloak draped over her senses. Thirst was sharper, a clawing in her throat. She tried to shift, to find a position that didn't send fire searing up her leg, but failed. Dust coated her tongue. The smell of dry earth filled her nostrils, a scent of endings. Above, the sky was a vast empty blue, mocking her grounded state. No birds circled, only the endless wind sighing its lonely song. She had seen buzzards earlier, distant specks against the blue canvas. They were patient. The thought brought no fear, only a weary resignation. This was how it ended. Not in battle, not surrounded by kin, but here, alone, surrendered to the earth and the wind. Her strength, the fierce resilience that had carried her through 17 summers, felt extinguished, a wet spark snuffed out. Tears, hot and useless, tracked paths through the grime on her cheeks. She closed her eyes, willing the world to simply cease, to fade into the quiet dark her body craved. But the body held its own stubborn will. It shivered, it ached, it demanded air and moisture. Her leg throbbed, a rhythmic drumbeat of agony. Each breath was a small victory against the weight of despair. She remembered the stories, the tales of ancestors who had endured impossible hardship, of spirits who walked the earth in animal form, offering aid or challenge. She saw only dust devils dancing on the horizon, illusions conjured by heat and failing vision. There were no spirits here, only the brutal reality of survival. A sound cut through the wind's monotone, a low, rhythmic thudding. Faint at first, then growing steadily louder. Hoofbeats. Not the scattered thunder of a moving camp, but the steady gait of a single rider. Fear, sharp and sudden, pierced the numbness. Who would be out here in this desolate expanse? Wanderers? Trappers? Men with hard eyes and no mercy? She tried to press herself deeper into the ground, to become one with the dirt, invisible. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. The sound grew closer. She held her breath, straining her ears. The thudding stopped. Then, silence again, but a different silence, one of stillness, of watching. She forced her eyes open, squinting against the glare. A shape materialized at the edge of her blurred vision. A horse, dark still, and mounted upon it, a man. He sat straight, motionless, observing. She couldn't make out his features against the sun. Only a silhouette, dark and imposing. He didn't call out. He simply waited. The air grew thick with unspoken tension. Fear coiled in her stomach. She was exposed, vulnerable, a broken animal caught in the open. She braced herself, expecting the worst, whatever form it might take. But still he did not move, did not speak. Only the wind offered sound, whispering secrets across the barren land between them. He dismounted slowly, movements deliberate, unhurried. He was tall, she saw now, lean and weathered, like a branch shaped by harsh winds. He wore simple, practical clothes, muted colors that blended with the landscape. He approached cautiously, not directly, but in a wide arc, his gaze fixed upon her. She watched him through half-closed eyes, feigning stillness, though her body screamed in protest and her mind raced with possibilities. Predator? Savior? He stopped several paces away, his hands held loosely at his sides, an unspoken sign of non-aggression, or perhaps just indifference. She could see his face now, lined, sun-darkened, with a thick, dust-colored mustache that hid his mouth. His eyes were light, pale against his tan skin, and they held a deep, unsettling stillness, like water in a hidden well. They took her in, the torn clothes, the awkward angle of her leg, the grime and despair etched on her face. There was no expression of pity, no gasp of surprise, only that quiet, steady observation. He knelt slowly, movements stiff, as if unused to bending. He still didn't speak. He reached out a hand, not towards her, but towards the small water skin abandoned near her. Her body tensed instinctively, but she was too weak to recoil. He picked it up, tested its weight. It was almost empty. He nodded once, a small, almost imperceptible motion. Then, without a word, he turned and walked back to his horse. Disappointment, sharp and bitter, pricked at her. He would leave her, then. It was a foolish hope anyway. Why would a stranger offer aid to someone left for dead? But he didn't mount. Instead, he rummaged in a saddlebag, pulling out a larger waterskin, plump and full. He walked back and knelt again, setting the full skin beside her. He didn't offer it to her, didn't insist. He simply placed it within reach. His light eyes met hers for a fleeting moment. There was no warmth, but also no malice. Only that deep, fathomless quiet. He then pulled out a piece of jerky, dark and tough-looking. He placed it next to the waterskin. Basic provisions. Enough to last a short time. Was this his help? A temporary reprieve before he left her to her fate. He rose, gathering the empty waterskin. He looked not at her, but across the vast, empty land towards the west. His gaze seemed to fix on something unseen by her. Then he spoke. His voice was low, rough, like stones grinding together. "My place is that way," he said, a slight tilt of his head indicating the direction. "Against the rocks. 2 days' ride. Maybe less for a sound leg." He paused, those still eyes returning to her. "If you make it," the blunt honesty was startling. He offered a destination, not a promise of rescue. It was a challenge, perhaps, or simply stating fact. He turned back to his horse. This time he mounted. He looked at her once more, a long, unreadable look. Then he turned the horse and rode away, the rhythmic thudding of hooves slowly fading back into the wind's embrace. He left her with water, jerky, and a direction. A sliver of hope, brutally framed by the immense difficulty of reaching it. She stared at the full waterskin, then at the vast empty space between her and the distant unseen rocks. 2 days' ride. For a sound leg. Her leg was broken. The despair threatened to consume her again. But the water was cool against her lips, the jerky tough but nourishing. And the direction, against the rocks, was something concrete in a world of formless desolation. She was still alone, still broken, but the absolute aloneness had been momentarily breached. He hadn't touched her, hadn't offered comfort, hadn't even asked her name. But he hadn't left her with nothing. It was a start. A fragile, almost imperceptible start. She drank slowly, letting the water revive her parched throat, and watched his diminishing figure until it was swallowed by the shimmering heat haze of the horizon. The next day was a blur of pain and painstaking movement. She had managed to drag herself a short distance, using her arms and her good leg, leaving a shallow furrow in the dust. The water and jerky had given her a fragile burst of energy, a defiance she hadn't thought she possessed. She moved agonizingly slowly, measuring her progress in agonizing feet, not miles. The sun beat down mercilessly. She tried to keep the distant line of rocks in sight, a hazy promise on the horizon. The wind was still her constant companion, sometimes a gentle push, more often a relentless force hindering her crawl. By evening, she had barely covered any ground. Exhaustion claimed her, and she sank back into the dirt, the meager progress a mocking testament to the impossible distance ahead. She awoke shivering in the pre-dawn chill. Her body protested every movement. Thirst was back, though less severe than before. She forced herself to eat more jerky, drink sparingly. The sun crept over the horizon, turning the sky a harsh, unforgiving orange. She began her slow, painful crawl again. It was a primal rhythm: push, drag, rest, repeat. The world narrowed to the few feet of ground before her, the ache in her limbs, the burning in her throat. She lost track of time, of direction, focusing only on the next agonizing inch. Then, unexpectedly, a shadow fell over her. She stopped, her heart leaping into her throat. She didn't need to look up to know who it was. The same rhythmic thudding had announced his arrival moments before she became aware of it. He dismounted, quieter this time, his movements still deliberate. He stood watching her for a long moment. She didn't look at him, focusing instead on the dust clinging to her fingers. She felt his presence, heavy and silent. Then, she heard a different sound, the clinking of metal. He knelt beside her. He didn't touch her leg, but his gaze was fixed upon it. He produced strips of rawhide, stiff and dry, and 2 pieces of wood, roughly shaped into splints. Still without a word, he began to work. His hands were large, calloused, but surprisingly gentle as they secured the splints around her leg. The process was painful, sending jolts through her, but his touch was firm and steady. He worked efficiently, his brow furrowed in concentration. When he finished, he tested the splints with a gentle pressure. The support, though crude, was immediate. The throbbing subsided slightly, replaced by a dull, contained ache. He rose. He had brought more water, more jerky. He placed them beside her. He still didn't offer her a hand, didn't ask if she was in pain. He simply provided the means to continue. He looked at her, his pale eyes unreadable. "It will hold," he said, his voice low. "Might make it easier, or harder," another blunt statement of fact. He hesitated for a moment, his gaze lingering on her face. Then he did something unexpected. He reached into his saddlebag again and pulled out a blanket, thick and woven. He unfolded it and placed it carefully over her shoulders. The simple weight, the unfamiliar warmth was overwhelming. Tears welled in her eyes, this time not of despair, but of something else, a fragile, tentative gratitude that tightened her throat. He didn't acknowledge the tears. He simply stood there for a moment longer, the blanket a silent offering of protection. Then he turned and walked back to his horse. "The rocks," he said, his voice carrying on the wind. "Keep them ahead." He mounted and rode away again, leaving her wrapped in the rough wool, the splinted leg feeling strangely both lighter and heavier. He hadn't saved her, not fully, but he had given her tools and direction and now warmth. It was a different kind of help than she had ever known. Pragmatic, silent, devoid of expectation or pity. He appeared when needed, offered what he could, and left her to fight her own battle. She looked at the distant rocks, now a clearer landmark with the splint providing some stability. She could maybe crawl faster now or even hobble a short distance. The impossible felt slightly less impossible. She had a name for the rocks now. His rocks. And the man, he was the silent rider. It was enough for now. With the splint providing a measure of support, Lila found that she could, with immense effort, bear some weight on her injured leg and hobble slowly forward. It was agonizing, each step sending tremors of pain through her, but it was faster than crawling. She focused fiercely on the line of rocks ahead, a dark, jagged scar against the horizon that seemed to grow and shrink with the heat haze. The silent rider appeared 2 more times over the next day and a half, always unexpectedly, always just when her resolve was beginning to fray or her meager supplies dwindled. He would simply appear, dismount, leave water and food, perhaps adjust the splint without a word, and then ride away. There was no conversation, no exchange of names, only the quiet ritual of necessary aid. She began to anticipate his appearances, not with yearning or dependence, but with a practical need that superseded fear. He was a part of the harsh landscape now, like the wind or the sun, a force that could be relied upon, albeit in his own remote fashion. When she finally reached the rocks, exhausted and limping, she found not a large mountain range, but a series of low, imposing bluffs that offered shelter and definition to the otherwise flat land. And nestled against the base of the largest bluff was a small, sturdy cabin, built of rough-hewn logs and stones. Smoke curled from its chimney, a beacon of human presence in the vast emptiness. She stopped a short distance away, hesitant. This was his place. The silent riders. Had he meant for her to come this far? Or was his help merely meant to extend her struggle, not end it at his doorstep? He emerged from the cabin as if he had been expecting her, though she had made no sound she was aware of. He stood on the small porch watching her approach. This time he didn't wear the air of detached observation. His pale eyes held a faint, unreadable expression. He waited until she had hobbled closer, stopping just outside the small yard surrounding the cabin. The air between them was thick with the weight of their silent, arduous journey together. "You made it," he said, his voice still low and rough. It wasn't a question, simply a statement of fact. She nodded, too weary to speak, her gaze fixed on his face. Up close, he looked older, the lines around his eyes deeper, etched by sun and solitude. He stepped off the porch. "Come in," he said, the words simple, direct. He didn't offer an arm, didn't fuss. He simply held the door open. Hesitantly, she limped towards the cabin. Crossing the threshold felt significant, like entering a different world. The inside was spare but clean. A rough table, a single chair, a narrow bunk built into the wall. A stone hearth where a fire crackled merrily, casting dancing shadows on the walls. The air was warm, smelling faintly of wood smoke and something else, something earthy and clean. It was a stark contrast to the endless, cold wind outside. He closed the door behind her, shutting out the vastness. He gestured towards the chair. "Sit." She lowered herself onto it with a sigh of relief, her injured leg protesting the sudden rest. He didn't sit with her. He moved to the hearth, adding a small piece of wood to the fire. The silence returned, but it was different this time, less charged with tension, more neutral. He glanced at her leg. "Need to look at that properly." She tensed. He didn't wait for an answer. He knelt again, his movements slow but steady. He gently unwrapped the rawhide splints he had made. He examined her leg with careful hands, his touch assessing, knowledgeable. She bit back a gasp of pain as he probed gently. "Clean break," he murmured, almost to himself. Lucky, he looked up at her. "Needs setting proper. And wrapping." Setting a broken bone was a terrifying prospect. She had seen it done before, the brutal, necessary manipulation. Fear tightened her chest. But his gaze was steady, his hands calm. "It will hurt," he stated, the honesty again disarming. "But it needs doing." She met his gaze. There was no coercion in his eyes, but a quiet certainty. He would do it whether she agreed or not, she sensed, because it was the necessary thing. And despite the fear, a flicker of trust, earned over the long miles of silent aid, allowed her to nod. "Do it?" she whispered, her voice hoarse. He nodded in return, a small, acknowledging gesture. He moved to a corner of the cabin, retrieving strips of clean cloth and a small, dark bottle. He poured a clear liquid onto the cloth. Antiseptic. She recognized the sharp smell. He returned to her side. "Bite down on this," he said, holding out a piece of clean hide folded thick. She took it with trembling fingers, placing it between her teeth. He nodded again. "Hold still." The next few moments were a blur of searing pain, a choked cry muffled by the hide, and the feeling of bone shifting, grating. His hands were firm, precise. When it was over, she was trembling, tears streaming down her face. But the sharp, misaligned pain was gone, replaced by a dull, aching throb. He wrapped the leg firmly with the clean cloth, securing it with more rawhide. He worked silently, efficiently, his face impassive. When he was done, he stood back. "It'll heal straight now." He offered her a mug of warm water, sweetened slightly with something she couldn't identify. She drank it gratefully. He then prepared a simple meal stew, fragrant and nourishing. He placed a bowl before her, along with a piece of coarse bread. He ate his own meal standing by the hearth, his movements quiet. They ate in silence, the only sounds the crackling fire and the gentle clinking of spoons against bowls. It was the first cooked meal she had eaten in what felt like a lifetime. After they ate, he cleared the bowls. He pointed to the bunk built into the wall. "You'll sleep there," he gestured to a pile of blankets. "They're clean." He didn't offer to help her, assuming she could manage. She could. It was painful, but she managed to get herself settled on the narrow bunk, pulling the blankets around her shoulders. They were rough, smelling of wood smoke and the man's scent, but they were warm. He blew out the lantern, plunging the cabin into semi-darkness, lit only by the dying embers in the hearth. He settled himself on the floor near the fire, wrapped in a single blanket. She lay there, listening to the sounds of the cabin, his quiet breathing, the settling of the logs, the wind rattling the window pane. She was safe. For now. She was still broken, still reliant on a stranger. But she wasn't alone in the vast, cold dark. And he wasn't silent anymore. He was Cal. She had heard him murmur his name to himself earlier, a quiet sound in the still cabin air.
Cal.
The man against the rocks. She closed her eyes, the pain in her leg a dull anchor in her body. But for the first time in a long time, sleep came without the crushing weight of despair. Days bled into a routine. Lila's leg healed slowly, a process of steady, aching progress. Cal was a man of few words, his days governed by the rhythms of the land and his solitary tasks. He would rise with the sun, tend to his horses, check traps if he had set any, work on repairs to the cabin or fences. Lila spent her days inside, cleaning the small space, mending clothes, sometimes hobbling outside to sit in the sun. She learned to anticipate his needs, anticipating when he would need water heated for washing, or when his meager pantry needed restocking from his root cellar. They communicated mostly through action and quiet observation. He taught her, without explicitly teaching, how to prepare certain foods, how to sharpen a knife, how to identify edible plants near the bluff. He watched her, she knew, assessing her quietly. He saw her growing strength, her determination not to be a burden. She saw his quiet competence, his deep connection to the harsh, beautiful land he called home. She learned about him through his silence as much as through his rare words. He lived alone by choice, it seemed. He had seen too much of the world, too much of people, and preferred the company of the rocks and the wind. He was self-sufficient, practical, and held a deep respect for the balance of nature. He never asked about her tribe, never asked why she was left behind. He seemed to accept her presence as another fact of the world, like a change in the weather or the turning of the seasons. This lack of prying was, paradoxically, what allowed her to begin to trust him. He didn't demand her story, didn't judge her or her people. He simply offered shelter and allowed her the space to heal. One evening, as they sat by the fire, the silence felt different. Less comfortable, more weighted. Her leg was mostly healed now. She could walk without crutches, albeit with a slight limp. The time for her to leave was approaching, unspoken but understood. "My leg is strong enough," she said, her voice quiet in the stillness. "I can travel now." He looked at her, his pale eyes steady. He didn't argue. "Where will you go?" he asked. The question hung in the air. She didn't know. Her tribe was gone. She couldn't go back. The world beyond this isolated bluff was unknown, potentially hostile. "I don't know," she admitted, the vulnerability raw in her voice. He was silent for a long time. The fire crackled. The wind sighed outside. "It's a hard land," he said finally. "For a woman alone." It was a simple statement, but it carried the weight of harsh truth. She nodded, acknowledging it. He rose and walked to the window, looking out at the dark, star-filled sky. His back was to her. "Stay," he said, the word low, almost lost in the wind. She stared at his back, surprised. "Stay? Here? With him? Stay?" she repeated, needing to be sure she had heard him right. He turned back to her. His expression was unreadable in the dim light. "Ayu," he confirmed, using a word she'd heard him use for yes. "If you want. Not as part of anything. Just stay. Work the place with me. It's too much for one man, really." Especially Winters, he seemed to struggle with the words, and used to offering anything beyond the purely necessary. Plenty of room. You can have the bunk. I'll sleep by the fire. It wasn't a romantic offer, not a declaration of affection. It was a practical proposal, born of necessity and perhaps, just perhaps, a quiet acknowledgement of the companionship they had found in their shared solitude. It was an offer of a place, a purpose, without demanding she change who she was or forget where she came from. It was, in its own way, an offer of belonging. Before she could answer, a noise shattered the quiet. Loud voices, the thud of horses' hooves approaching fast. Not a single rider, several, heading straight for the cabin. Cal's head snapped up, his body tensing. He moved with surprising speed, crossing the room to grab a rifle from where it leaned against the wall. "Stay back," he ordered, his voice low and sharp. He moved to the window, peering out cautiously. Heavy knocks, then shouts, came from the door. "Open up. We know you're in there." Cal's face was grim. "Drifters. Trouble." He didn't open the door. "What do you want?" he called back, his voice steady. "Got business. Here you're holed up with something valuable." A rough voice yelled back. "Open the door, or we open it ourselves." They meant her. The valuable something must be her. Perhaps word had somehow traveled, or perhaps they simply assumed an isolated man might have something worth taking. Fear, cold and sharp, seized Lila. She was a liability, a magnet for trouble. She started to rise from the chair, intending to hide, to draw attention away. "Stay put," Cal said, not taking his eyes from the window. He checked the rifle's action. "My business now." The sounds outside grew rougher, kicking at the door, the splintering of wood. Cal took a position beside the window, rifle raised. He was ready to defend his home, his solitude, and, she realized with a sudden, powerful surge of emotion, he was ready to defend her. The door burst open with a splintering crash. Two figures lunged into the firelight, silhouetted against the night sky.
Cal Firat.
The blast deafened her for a moment. One figure crumpled with a cry. The other staggered back. Cal moved surprisingly fast for his age, covering the ground to the doorway. A third figure appeared, aiming a pistol. Lila didn't think. She saw Cal exposed, saw the glint of metal. Her legs still ached, but years of ingrained instinct took over. She grabbed the heavy iron poker from beside the hearth, hobbled forward, and swung it with all her might at the arm holding the pistol. There was a crack, a yell of pain, and the pistol clattered to the floor. Cal turned, surprised, his eyes widening slightly as he took in her action. He didn't hesitate. He leveled the rifle and fired again. A thud as the third man fell. Silence descended, broken only by the groans of the injured outside. Cal stood in the doorway for a moment, listening. "That's it," he murmured, lowering the rifle slightly. He looked back at her, his pale eyes holding a new expression she hadn't seen before. Not just acceptance, but respect. Lila leaned against the doorframe, the poker still clutched in her trembling hands, her leg throbbing fiercely from the sudden movement. She hadn't hidden. She hadn't been a victim. She had acted, defended, fought back. She wasn't the broken, abandoned girl anymore. Cal walked over to her slowly. He gently took the poker from her hands. His touch was firm, his gaze steady. "Didn't stay put," he said, a faint, almost smile touching the corners of his mustache. She met his gaze, her chest still heaving. "Couldn't," she whispered. "Not anymore." He nodded, a slow, deliberate nod. The shared danger had stripped away the last vestiges of distance between them. They had faced a threat together, acted as one unit without planning or practice. He looked at the broken door, then back at her. The silence stretched, different again now, filled with unspoken understanding. "Looks like we'll have to fix that door," he said, his voice back to its low, rough tone. Lila managed a small, shaky smile. "Looks like," she agreed. He turned and walked back towards the hearth, setting the rifle down. He looked at the bunk, then at the floor where his blanket lay. He picked up his blanket and placed it on the bunk. He looked at her, his expression unreadable. "You take the bunk," he said simply. It wasn't just about a place to sleep anymore. It was a quiet gesture, an acceptance of her presence, an unspoken acknowledgement of her place here. It wasn't the home she had lost, wasn't the family that had abandoned her, but it was something real, built on dust and pain and shared defense. Lila looked at the bunk, then at the quiet man by the fire. She didn't know what the future held, but she wouldn't face it alone anymore. The wind still howled outside, the land was still vast and unforgiving, but inside the small cabin, against the rocks, there was warmth and quiet strength, and a fragile, hard-earned partnership. She had been left for dead, but she had found life, and a kind of belonging, in the most unexpected of places. Resilience wasn't about enduring alone. Sometimes, it was about finding the strength to stand together, even silently, against the coming storm. She straightened her shoulders, ignoring the protest from her leg. There was a door to fix, work to be done. And she was no longer a survivor merely enduring. She was a partner, standing ready.